when I start to render the face a little like this, I'm immediately trying to think of a light source, you know, and I'll often, when I'm considering this, I'll often think of a ball or a sphere and where that is being lit from. And in my mind, I consider the light source. If I was to draw it as an arrow, I'd draw it as a 3D arrow. And that's quite useful for me anyway, because it helps me understand that this is maybe coming from this angle rather than if I do this, it's coming from this angle. So again, those principles of breaking it down to its basic elements are really useful. You know, this area of the forehead here, really, there is subtle nuances to the brow and maybe the furrows in the brow and this ridge along the skull. But if you're going to consider the whole thing initially as a spherical object like this, then you know that you have a point of highlight here, and you can kind of just build around that. As I say, I'm largely self-taught, so a lot of this stuff is learned by mistake rather than by teaching. Really do recommend a lot of life classes or life studies or drawing from your friends or family members. It's a really useful exercise. And I think I have the mindset that if you can, whenever you're drawing or trying to study something, if you can understand the mechanics of it and go a little bit deeper than just the surface layer, then you can, when it comes to drawing it from memory without reference, it's a lot easier to do because you've broken it down to its composite elements, you know, whether that's anatomy, a basic understanding of skeleton and musculature and these kind of things, or whether it's costuming. Don't always look at the surface and consider that's the end result. You need to know what's going on underneath there to really be able to go back and draw this without reference. I think it applies with everything that you draw, really, whether it's a technical motor vehicles or you know, weaponry, or if you can understand how the thing works, then when you come to draw it, it's going to be a lot easier to draw without reference. There's little elements that I look for when I'm rendering the face like this. Like I often consider having this light source where I spoke about coming from a kind of above and direct on the forehead there. And I look for these areas of highlights that might just ping off the side of the nostril there and on the tip of the nose. And again, you know, even with the upper lip there, if you consider it as a basic shape, and then light it, as I said, with the sphere, then you can start to consider how to make that look 3D. And it's the same principle to almost every element of drawing, really. With the face, I'm just breaking them down into smaller shapes and elements that I can light as I go along. So really the chin is almost another sphere, the lower lip. And you can see really that using that principle, you only really need a fairly basic understanding of perspective and drawing and lighting to do that. And then you can apply it into a much more complex looking subject, i.e. the face. Of course, it takes a lot of years of practice, but I think if I'd had somebody teaching me this at an early age, then maybe I would have progressed a lot quicker and made a lot less mistakes. Also, you know that, as I spoke about, I have a real love of portraiture. Often talk about the paintings of Velázquez and Singer Sargent, and De Laszlo and Ilya Repin, all these kind of real classic painters. So I do a lot of work in oil paint myself. So when you're working in oil paint, you spend a majority of your time working on the midtones. You don't go straight in and focus on the lights and the darks. They're probably maybe the last parts of the painting that you pay any attention to. And the analogy that I've spoke about before is to consider that if you were a sculptor making a face from clay, you wouldn't simply make a ball and try and draw the features on over the top. You spend the majority of your time modeling these little nuances and these little changes in plane and form. And it's only right at the end that they may go in and carve a sharper line or maybe mark the lips with a real deep cut. And for me, it's the same with drawing. I want to spend, although, you know, I've started to mark some of the features in there, the majority of my time is spent playing with the midtones and those values to really give it some depth and weight and believability. And same principle applies with costume detailing. And if you can observe things like materials and surface textures and the way that certain fabric has a different weight. You know, if it's a heavy wool, the folds are thicker and less. If it's a silk, they're far more flowing. All these kind of things are useful to observe as well. And you can learn a lot of that stuff from life drawing classes or setting up your own little studies, you know, whether it be still lifes or you know, getting a model or a friend to pose for you. There's a lot of ways to do it. You just have to be a little disciplined, I think, because you don't get instant results, but it's like weapons in your armory for a later date. So as I go along, I'm actually going a little heavier with the tones here and starting to refine some of the basic form around the lid there. And when you're doing this, I quite like this stage as well, because you can make the slightest little change can affect the mood of the character quite a lot, you know. And just by pulling the brow down a bit more, I can make him look a bit more angry and aggressive. I often use, I don't strictly use a cross-hatching, but I'll often use the lines to help describe the form as well. I quite like that idea that you can use it to, for example, if you're drawing an arm and it's foreshortened, in its most basic form like this, then I'll often use lines which follow that form when it comes to shading it, and it just helps to describe to the viewer and to yourself, you know, what's going on there, and put it in a bit of perspective. And foreshortening can be very difficult to handle, you know, especially if you're using only lines. So